the entire Bible and see if we can get the big picture, if we can get these big ideas in our head, and it will really influence us when we are reading these individual passages and these individual sections and seeing some good material there too. So tonight, we're going to continue doing that. We started with holiness. This is what I consider to be the ultimate starting point, because without the holiness of God, a lot of these discussions don't matter. Without the absolute difference that God's character makes in his creation, the fact that he is holy gives everything else a lot of its meaning, a lot of its discussion. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at as we carry that into this thing that he made, this earth, and all of us who are sitting here on it, and how we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing. And ultimately, what we want is we want to live in a just world. Now, kind of had this thought last week a little bit and wanted to see if we could have some ideas about it a little bit tonight as we get into the discussion right before we watch this video, where we start talking about problems in the world. And I want some feedback here, whether you're watching on Facebook and it catches up to us while we're discussing it, or the 6 or 7 of us that are here. This question that I want to point out just for discussion's sake: what are some of the ways that we can look around our world today and know that it's not always just, that it's not always right or righteous or what it's supposed to be? That's going to be, we have to be able to identify these things. We have to be able to identify problems. So I thought we'd spend a little bit of time, just getting some basic ideas, your thoughts. What is it that bothers you when you look out at the world, when you look out at our communities or in our homes, or just anything specifically like that? Well, I give you a second to think about how you would answer that question. I'm going to give you a second to answer, or to think about how would you answer this question. What are some examples of what's wrong with the world today? Take a minute, introduce our guest tonight. Not our guest of honor by any stretch of the imagination, but we do have a new guy with us tonight, and I invited him to join us. If you had the opportunity on Facebook yesterday or earlier today to see the graduation video that Logan put together, and it has been circulating around, I appreciated that. That's really neat. It's really fun. There's some cool stuff on there. One of the cool things that's on there is my good friend Brian Dill. And I got in touch with him earlier this week and said, hey, man, you're not doing anything else on Wednesday night, right? You could drop by and solve all of the problems of the world for us, or during an hour-long Zoom discussion, right? And he said, obviously, I can do that. That shouldn't be any trouble at all. So, Brian, how would you introduce yourself to these folks if they don't know you? Some of them do, some of them don't.
Yeah, I'm noticing that there are more on here that do know me than I expected. How to introduce me? I don't know. The fact that Adam and I have been friends for as long as we have probably tells you that I don't know how little you may be able to trust me, or
something's wrong with one of us, but
yeah.
Not sure which one.
Yeah,
definitely. Brian preaches up in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And of course, they've been doing their own kind of modifications to their worship services and things like that. Brian, what kind of, what's the atmosphere? What's the attitude up there towards getting back together, and what kind of plans do you guys have?
Oh man, everybody is sick and tired of it. Everybody is ready to be back. And we actually contacted everybody in our congregation over the weekend to see if they felt comfortable coming back on May 31st, which is our target date right now. And to a T, everybody said, yes, please. We want to be back.
Yeah, I think that's probably the way that it's going for everybody. We had a Sunday night here, a kind of a drive-in service that was really good. We enjoyed that. Our elders did meet last night, and I'll go ahead and make this plug right now. Stick around to the end of Bible class tonight, because at the conclusion of our study, I will inform you on our plans for this coming Sunday morning. You might be interested in what I have to say. So Well, Brian might not be interested in what I have to say because he'd have a long way to drive from Hopkinsville. But everybody that's around here in the Florence, Alabama area might be interested to know that. I think it is possible that we are admitting another guest speaker tonight. If you will look in the latest to join section, here is another good friend, Andy Brewster. Andy preaches over for the Charlotte Avenue congregation, and that's over on the North Carolina, South Carolina line. And again, a good preaching friend. And I thought, you know what, these folks, they're so tired of listening to me. If I could get some real good preachers in this discussion, then they might be more able to put up with it for the long run. So I know Barron has been providing us with most of the intelligence in these Zoom meetings on Wednesday nights, but it wouldn't hurt to get a little bit extra info. So Andy, how are you doing this evening?
Great. How are y'all?
Fantastic. He answered for everyone in the group without letting them unmute their microphones. But there will be just time for discussion and things like that. I just finished talking to Brian about, these virtual meetings and stuff like that. Has Charlotte Avenue, the congregation there, thought about when you guys want to get together or how you're going to do that or anything?
We actually met this past Sunday for the first time, had 2 services, and had about 90 total. We had about 70 in our first one, about 20 in our second. That's about half of our membership. So getting there, and it was a good day. It's good to be back together.
Fantastic. All right. Well, that's good. Like I said, we've got an announcement at the end of class tonight about our upcoming Sunday and some ideas we're thinking about. Brian said their congregation is looking at maybe the end of this month, the last Sunday. So all kind of good options. But if you're on Facebook with us or wherever you are, be ready with questions about that announcement that we'll get to at the end. But I had posed a question that I want to just use for folks either typing on Facebook, or if you're here in the Zoom meeting and have some thoughts. Somebody came up to you and asked, how do you know, or what makes you think that this world isn't exactly what it's supposed to be and it's the best version of the world that we could hope for? What kinds of things would you point to, whether it's specifics or just ideas in general? Raise your hand if you got an idea. How would you answer somebody and point out the fact that this world has its fair share of problems? Anybody got any thoughts on that? All right, go ahead, Kevin, unmute yourself and give us a thought.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't say it's purpose misinformation about all this stuff going on, but it's not reliable information. Your Bible is your only reliable information. Everything, whether you see it on the news or you read it in the paper or whatever, one day, we're all going to die from it. Next day, no, it ain't that bad. It changes rapidly. We're still like working for the city. It's one day, it's basically the same thing. Oh, we can't do nothing. Then the next day, well, we're going to look at, in a couple of weeks doing so-and-so. And then the day after that, no, we're not going to do anything. It changes so many times. It's just half the time I don't even ask.
We get really frustrated. Yep.
Because there's nothing dependable. There's nothing firm. And I keep going back every time I hear something back to this passage in the Bible. Let your yes be yes and no be no.
Get it together,
wrong,
people.
Even if you're going to be wrong, just stick with something and be wrong about it. Own it. Yes, own it.
Own it, yeah.
You're going to screw up. Just own it and screw up and be done with it, but don't, as the term goes, crawfish and back up, well, that wasn't what I meant.
Right.
You see that all the time in the news, and whether it's local media, national media, or anything. Oh, that's not what
everybody's trying to, maybe that's a good example, a good illustration. Everybody's trying to cover themselves. Everybody's trying to cover their own back and their own interest. And even if it means kind of backpedaling, like you said, I decided to turn off comments over in the Facebook page because I just received a comment on how you know that things are not right in the world from Michael Burns. And he says Clemson winning national championships. I'm very offended by that. So just want to make everybody aware that kind of stuff will not be tolerated. And Cecil, I'll be talking to you later. You'll be called in for an elders meeting. No, I can't do that. They'll agree with you. Never mind. Anybody else have any, those are some good examples. What's some other proofs? How do you see the problems in the world, the proof that the world could be better than it is right now? All right, go ahead, Baron.
I'm confused whether you're talking about the world as in people or the world as in creation. Which one do you mean?
All right, well, tell us why they're not the same thing first, and then I'll tell you which direction I want you to go.
Well, I would think that in creation, God has made everything in a way that is good, as the biblical author says that it's good, and he makes it good. And yet I do think that humans have a tendency to do really dumb things. Well, so much dumb that they become evil things, and so many evil things that it affects their lives and the world that they live in. So I don't know, like the world as it is, I think is in the creational sense is fine, but humans, well, are we ever going to get any better?
Right.
And not until the Lord comes.
Yeah. Okay. So you even used the word evil that, jogs part of this conversation. Is the world capable of evil? Is creation capable of evil? Or are people the only things that are capable of evil? What do you think? What do you think, Baron?
I think that people are capable of a lot of evil. I don't know about the world. I mean, the world just does. Inanimate objects don't have feelings, so I don't know. That's just my thought on it.
And then, of course, you got to factor in, Genesis 3 tells us that the ground is cursed. Creation does carry a curse. So I don't think we would say that this is the best possible world that it could be. But yeah, I do think, like you point out, I'm dealing more with people and circumstances that people demonstrate our inability to get things right, and the damage that causes. I'm thinking about the video we watched last week about justice and what happens when the world is not just. And that's most of the time going to be associated with people. We don't think anything about justice when a tree falls in the middle of the road and causes a car wreck, so that's true. Did anybody else have a thought how they would answer that question?
I think in some ways, Adam, you can say, one of the proofs for there being a God is the fact that beauty exists. So in a similar way, you could say, well, the world can be better because there is some good in the world. So if there were more good in the world, then in theory, the world, creation, people could be better. So I think that's a simple explanation, I think. But, the existence of good means that it is possible, which means there can be more of it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that helps us to recognize when it's not good. We can see when something is beautiful. We have that ability to recognize that goodness and that beauty. And then we can recognize when something is marred or broken or not what it's supposed to be, something like that. So that's good. Autumn, go ahead. What you got?
Well, when thinking about justice, I think about the fact that what might seem just in the moment in my situation might actually be an injustice toward or for someone else, or cause a problem for someone else. And God is the only one that can see the big picture and can see all of creation, all of us, all of what's right and good. And so really he's the perfect justice that we can't see. I think about the way that he talks to Job at the end of that book. Are you really going to challenge my justice to justify yourself, is what he tells Job. And so I think we're limited in what we can see, what we can view. We don't see the big picture, and God can.
Yeah, I think the big picture is going to be a critical element of that, because a lot of the times people react in a certain way because they think they're bringing justice. They think they're making things right when they may actually be causing more harm than good. And I think that's evidence of the problem. I think that's evidence of the issue, is that sometimes we can't even tell if this response is going to make things better or make things worse, and so not knowing how to fix something sometimes is proof that there's a real issue going on. So I like that. I think that's true. I'm just wanting us to think about, the condition of this world that we live in, because I heard of a saying one time. I think I heard it first in reading somebody's graduation speech, some commencement, somewhere. And so we're all thinking about that right now. But it's talked about how fish don't know that they're wet, is the bottom line, is that we live in an environment and we're not familiar with our environment. You never think about that with fish, but none of us walk around considering the oxygen concentration in the air that we breathe, unless it goes too low for some reason. If you go to Denver, Colorado, and all of a sudden you're in an atmosphere that has less oxygen, and you're thinking, oh, okay, something's not right. I mean, we don't think about our environment very much. We just live in it. And that's true about the world that we live in as well, when we talk about good and bad and problems. And if we stop and think, is this world as good as it can be? Well, no, I don't think anybody would say that, but at the same time, a lot of times we just get caught up in the day-to-day struggle of just keeping our head down and continuing on. And we don't think about all of the different ways that this world displays its problems all around us. I spent the afternoon with a homeless lady today. She had come by the building on Sunday night and was talking about some problems, and wound up trying to take her to the hospital, and that didn't work. And then today, trying to get her, to different places and things, and living in her world for an hour and a half, seeing the world through her eyes, where you can't trust people. People aren't trustworthy. People aren't there to help you. They're against you. Where you don't have any resources. You don't feel like you have any help to accomplish things or get things done. And looking at it from that perspective, every time you turn around and try to go one direction, there's a wall being put up in your place. The world becomes a much scarier place in those situations, in that atmosphere. And until we see it from those perspectives, a lot of times that stuff is hidden from us. Now, again, do we get ourselves into these situations, or do they happen to us? That's, kind of a different story, a different discussion, but it's just more proof that there are people that see this world in different ways. We're going to watch this video. It's about 5 minutes long, and it's going to dive into the subject of sin. We're going to talk about bad words. So this is a series that the Bible Project has, bad words in the Bible. Now, of course, I think they're trying to get our attention with that, think about what bad words there might be. Can we say those words or not? But it's talking about the words that cause problems for us. And as you watch this video, it's going to be about sin. And I want you to be thinking about some ideas while we watch this, and we're going to just kind of open it up for discussion. I've got a couple of things I want to bring out, and I've asked, I've put it out on Facebook for other people to ask for some ideas. And then Andy and Brian, I asked them to come up with a thought or two to go along with it also. But before we watch it, I want you to be thinking about what sin is. And I want you to think about, there's 3 or 4 basic kind of ideas that people put out about what is sin. Is sin something that we do? Is sin something that we're born with? Is sin something that we are? Or is sin something that's out to get us? It's this outside entity or force. How do you think about sin? How do you envision sin from the Bible, and what does the Bible have to say about it? And I think as we, look at it in those terms, we're going to have some time to discuss that. So be putting your thoughts together on, what is sin? Something that we do? Is it something that we are? Is it something that we're born with? Something that's out to get us? how would you answer that question? And we're going to look at some of these Bible ideas about sin. Let's see, where did it go? Here in just a second. So I am going to have to, well, I had it open and it closed on me. There it is. All right, where'd you go? Okay, good. All right, go back and try this again. Never have any issues when we're trying to do stuff. Let's see, is that right? Nope, that's not right. All right, we're gonna do this.
You are screen sharing.
I'm screen sharing, but is it sharing Windows Explorer?
Yep.
Okay. What's it showing now?
Still your library.
Okay. All right. Let me
Go to passwords so I can see.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, definitely. I should open that up. I have this video and it's open, but it's not showing as a screen that I can share. Share computer and audio, optimize screen for video. I'm going to just share screen number 1. All right. So now what does it show?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. So there's a video. Autumn, you keep a watch and tell me if you can't hear the audio when it starts playing and let me know. But otherwise, we're going to watch this video 5 minutes long, thinking about sin.
Most people assume the Bible has a lot to say about how messed up humans are, and that's true. It's also true that the Bible's vocabulary about this topic sounds odd to modern people, using words like sin, iniquity, or transgression. And so the Bible's perspective on the human condition is often ignored or treated as ancient and backwards. This is really unfortunate, because through these words, the biblical authors are offering us a deeply profound diagnosis of human nature. Iniquity describes behavior that's crooked, while transgression refers to breaking trust. And sin, this is actually the most common of these bad words in the Bible, so let's focus on it for a few minutes. Sin translates the Hebrew word chata and the Greek word hamartia. The most basic meaning of sin isn't religious at all. Chata simply means to fail or miss the goal. Like when the Israelite tribe of Benjamin trained a small army of slingshot experts, they could sling a stone at a hare and not chata, that is, fail or miss. Or there's a biblical proverb that warns against making hasty decisions because you're likely to chata your way, miss your destination. So in the Bible, sin is a failure to fulfill a goal. But what's the goal? Well, on page 1 of the Bible, we learn that every human is an image of God, a sacred being who represents the Creator and is worthy of respect. And so in this way of seeing the world, sin is a failure to love God and others by not treating them with the honor they deserve. You can see this idea in the famous code of conduct given to the Israelites, the 10 Commandments. Half of them identify ways you can fail at loving God, and the other half name ways you can fail at loving people. And the fact that both kinds of failure are combined shows that failing to honor God is deeply connected to failing to honor people. This is why in the Bible, sin against people is sin against God. Like when Joseph refuses to sleep with the wife of Potiphar, he says, "How could I sin against God?" In Joseph's mind, failing to honor a human made in God's image is a failure to love God. And so, sin is a failure to be truly human. But there's more. A fascinating thing about sin in the Bible is that most of the time that people are failing, they either don't know it, or even worse, they think they're succeeding. Like when Pharaoh wants to build Egypt's economy and protect national security, in his mind, this justifies enslaving the Israelites. He thinks it's good, and he's totally unaware that it's an epic fail. Or when King Saul is chasing David around the wilderness trying to kill him, he thought he was bringing a criminal to justice until he realizes he's the corrupt one. And he says, "I have sinned. I am the failure." So sin is about more than just doing bad things. It describes how we easily deceive ourselves and spin illusions to redefine our bad decisions as good ones. So why are humans such bad judges between moral failure and success? Well, the first appearance of the word sin in the Bible offers an insight. There are these two brothers, Cain and Abel. Their parents had just given in to this beastly temptation to redefine good and evil by their own wisdom, and now Cain is faced with a similar choice. He's jealous and angry that God has favored his brother, and so God warns him, if you don't choose what is good, Chata is crouching at the door, it wants you. But you can rule over it. So in these stories, sin, or moral failure, is depicted as this wild, hungry animal that wants to consume humans. And we know how that story ends. The Bible is trying to tell us that failed human behavior, our tendency towards self-deception, it runs deep. It's rooted in our desires and selfish urges that compel us to act for our own benefit at the expense of others. And it leads to this chain reaction of relational breakdown. This is why in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul describes hamartia as a power or a force that rules humans. In his words, we are slaves to sin. He even says sin lives in us, so that the things I don't want to do, that's what I do. So with the word sin, the biblical authors are offering a robust description of the human condition. It's a failure to be humans who fully love God and others. It's our inability to judge whether we're succeeding or failing, and it's that deep, selfish impulse that drives much of our behavior. This is not a pretty picture of ourselves, but if we're honest, it's realistic. This is why in the Bible, the story of Jesus is such good news. He's depicted as the Creator become a truly human one who did not fail to love God and others. That is, he did not sin. And yet, he took responsibility for humanity's history of failure. He lived for others, and he died for their sins. And he was raised from the dead to offer them the gift of his life that covers for their failures. Or in the words of the apostles, he committed no sin, yet he carried our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to our sins and live to do what is right. And that's the story behind the biblical word for sin.
All right, so there's just a quick 5-minute introduction to this idea that sin is this breakdown, is this failure, and we're going to kind of examine and think about this failure and what it means, what it represents for us tonight. When it talks about the 10 Commandments, what do you remember from the video or the thoughts being shared there about what is sin? Sin is a failure to do what two basic things? Somebody who remembers and can remind us of that. What are the two basic things from the 10 Commandments that we're being pointed to accomplish, that when we fail in them, we are committing a sin? Anybody?
Properly loving God and people.
Right. Yeah. And then Jesus makes that summary very plain in the New Testament, doesn't he? The greatest commandment and the second that's like unto it. Right. And so when he says all the law and the prophets hang on those, I think that's what they're getting at here is that failing to honor God or failing to honor people is an example of a problem or a brokenness in this world. And then it takes it a step farther when it talks about the quote from Joseph in Genesis 37. And it says, when we fail to honor people, what ultimately are we doing?
Sinning against God.
Yes, that's it. All failure to honor, whether that's honoring other people or honoring God, eventually makes its way up to being a failure against God, to honor and respect God. Of course, I think we get to that because we realize that if we are made in the image of God, if every person truly is carrying the creation and the goodness of God within them, when we don't respect, when we don't honor, when we don't treat that in a worthy manner, that's why it goes back to disrespecting the God that created these individuals and these people. Now, how would you tie that in with justice that we talked about last week? what would be your response there when we're talking about justice from last week and the need for justice as an expression of holiness, and then how sin is a failure to honor people the way that they deserve to be honored? How do those concepts connect in your mind? How would you talk about that? And maybe I don't even know because I'm confusing my question.
We're doing a study on Romans at Charlotte Avenue, and talking about just and sin, of course, and God's grace and that sort of thing. And in Romans, it says God is just and the justifier. So I think that definitely ties into this idea of the only way that we can be just because of our sin is through Christ's righteousness.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'd forgotten about that passage in Romans. God is not just a just God, but he is the justifier. So that's a great point. Anybody else have any thoughts on that before we kind of progress on? I'm wanting to make sure we open this up. Go ahead, Brian. Yeah.
I was just going to say that a lot of times injustice is connected to a lack of action. And I feel like sometimes we get carried away with looking at sin only from a don't do list, right? A series of things that you're not supposed to do. But there's a lot of things that we are called by God to do in our relationships with others. And when we fail at those, that's every bit as much sin as anything else. And when I look at justice and injustice, I think that a lot of times when we refuse to do certain things for some people, we make assumptions about other people, that sort of thing. A lot of times that leads to that type of sin.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I hadn't even thought about the active and the passive nature, of sin. We think about sin as an action, that you actively go out and commit a sin. But then if you tie it to justice, then, think the parable of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite. Well, they didn't actively do anything bad, did they? They didn't go beat that guy up, right. They just failed to do something good. And isn't that the way kind of that James talks about it? For him who knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. To him it is. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in Matthew 25, the division of the sheep and goats has everything to do with what you didn't do in your life. And that can be kind of scary.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great reminder. Man, that's exactly right.
Yeah, and in that passage, it's talking about, the righteous and the unrighteous, both in that passage, they treated people, they took care of people they thought were important. The problem was that the unrighteous didn't think everybody was important. Circling back to this idea of, everybody's created in the image of God. Everybody has value because of that. And that's our struggle today. It's my struggle to consider every single person who's alive is important. And I need to treat everyone the same way that I want to be treated, the same way that I would treat my family, treat them with that same type of respect.
Yeah, and that's super, super hard to do. That's exactly right. It can be exhausting and it can be difficult. So when we continue thinking about what sin is, it mentions this passage in Genesis, I want to say chapter 5, maybe, after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel are struggling. Cain has this really bad day and God comes to him ahead of time and God lets him know, look, you are entering dangerous territory. And the way that Moses writes this down for us is says God tells Cain, you've got to be on guard because sin is crouching at the door and its desire is to have you. Thanks, Autumn. It's Genesis 4, around verse 7. So what do you think about sin? What is sin? Is sin something that we do? Is it something that we're born with? Is it something that we are? Is it something that's out there? It's a separate entity and it's out to get us. What do you think? Who's got some thoughts on that? Come on, be bold, be brave. Tell me what you think. Jeff Ziegler, I know you got some opinions on this, basically because you have opinions on everything, but this one's just as much as anything else. What do you think?
Well, first of all, if I'm having a hard time keeping a straight face, it's because Brian's here.
That goes back a couple of days, doesn't it?
Yeah, it goes back a while to camp and a couple of funny memories there. But anyway, sin comes down to, I had a thought there for a second.
Brian Deal, it's his fault.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I just threw it out there, but I was going to say it had to do with something with choice.
True. Yeah. Do we have a choice when it comes to sin?
Yeah.
People.
Sin is not. The old saying, "The devil made me do it." All of those. It doesn't apply because you've got to make a choice, and and that choice is active or passive. You can make a choice to be passive.
Right.
I'm not going to participate in that, or you can make a choice to be active in the sin. So either way, it's not. My point is I don't see it as something creeping, like this beast that's, crawling around trying to get me, like in those, was it Frank, whatever novels?
Frank Peretti.
Yeah, that, yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness. Yeah. He had a book called Monster that was really okay.
Yeah, it's not some monster or whatever. Sin is there and sin is a choice. Many people that are trying trip us up with our belief in God and Jesus and stuff say, well, if God was this, that, or the other thing, why would he tempt Adam and Eve with that fruit?
Right. Why did he even put that tree in the garden in the first place?
Put it in there? And the answer is choice. He wanted them to choose to love him of their own free will. So if there was no choice in to do wrong in the garden, then they'd just be robots.
Right. And that's not part of what, God's creation, was about. All right, good. All right, Autumn, what have you got?
I think that's a good point in that, especially, people who say, why did God allow sin or put sin? If you look at sin the way the video describes it as a failure, it's a lack of something. It's not something additional that God put into creation. It's that not living up to the full human potential that is what God created us to be. And so God didn't do anything. God didn't even, place that bad there. That bad is there because we failed to live up to our human potential.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that, I think. Doug reminds me that the common terminology we use for that, sins of omission and sins of commission. You can commit sins, or you can omit actions that you should have done, that get us in just as much trouble. Baron, I got to share this about sin is a pest, which of course I think of pests as being external things, but he's got a real good sermon outline here. Have you preached this before, Baron? Or is this not new to you? You learned it where?
I learned that in a class that I took, systematic theology at Harding, about the idea of. Well, I'll just let you read it. You have it up.
I do, but it's a thought that you shared. As a pest, sin affects us psychologically, messes with our mind. It affects us ecologically, messes up the world. Sociologically, it messes in the relationships from person to person, and theologically, it messes with my relationship between myself and God. So you want a neat little device to kind of see all the areas that sin infects the world and causes problems. It's a pest. I think that's pretty good.
I do have a comment.
Go.
I think one of the problems with sin is that there are elements of it that do creep around, that Ephesians says this, there is a world that we cannot see that we are battling against every day. And a world that we cannot see, of course, they may not be creeping around. They may be deep in battle, but there is a part of us as people that are constantly desiring things, and they're really skewed desires. They're they could be for bounty, they could be for food, but a desire for food can turn into indulgence and can turn into something evil and wrong. A desire for good relationships can be misused and abused for wrong reasons. And I think part of, I agree and somewhat disagree with the idea that sin doesn't creep, because I don't think these things always happen. And I don't think Jeff was trying to say this. And I don't mean to just pick on Jeff, but
it's okay.
We always have these things that are always telling us to maybe do something that we shouldn't do, and they're not always just blatant decisions. A blatant decision would be right there. You have a choice to rob a store or not. Well, no, that's not actually like what happens. What happens is, I'm in a situation that causes me to make a decision. I don't know if that makes any sense. I had a better thought.
Environment.
It's the environment, nurturing. Like, I don't think that we're born able to sin, but when things don't go our way, we want to, and we might not even be able to put a word on it. One of the best books about this is in Proverbs. Choose the way that you will go. Which road will you go? There's two women and they're sitting on either sides, and one is loud and obnoxious, and she wants you to come, and what she has to offer is bad bread and bad water, poisonous water. Will you go to her and death, or will you go to Lady Wisdom, who is kind and generous and good, and she has a full meal prepared waiting for you to come to take part in? Which will you take part in? And the problem is we mainly choose the foolish woman. We
right. And what I always thought is great about that is the foolish woman, the one that's trying to lead us astray. She basically models herself as a cheap knockoff of what Lady Wisdom is offering. It's like she's trying to give the same stuff, the same substance, but you can get it by a shortcut. You can get it without putting in the work and the effort and the moral uprightness. You can still, kind of lurk around and take shortcuts and have access to this stuff. And that goes back to what you said earlier. So many of the times our sins, maybe they didn't start off as a pursuit of evil. Maybe they started off as a pursuit of something good, but then we took it too far. We took it in a different direction than what we should have, or something along those lines. And so just like, Satan has a really good way of enticing us with something that is seeming to be positive and seeming to be good. I know that Richard and Chelsea both had their hands up, so I'm gonna let them unmute their mics and share whatever they were thinking.
Let's say you have a table, and there's a king of the table. The part that is God's is one part of the title, the rest is the other kingdom of Satan's kingdom. And sin is the way of life in Satan's kingdom, and God is the way of life in Jesus, God's kingdom. And the sin way of life is always going to be lazier, and the way of life in God's kingdom is always going to be harder. And it's whether we're going to do the lazy thing or to do the harder thing, the right thing. And it's always going to have conscience to do what is right. You can't accidentally do what's right. You have to actually know what you're doing and be prepared to put forward that effort.
Right. I think that makes a good point. It's something that you have to be intentional about. Before y'all keep talking and Chelsea gives her thought, I'm going to, the internet connections there are really choppy. Try cutting off the video, but leave your microphone unmuted. And I think if it's not trying to send video as much, it'll let us hear what you're trying to say. So be doing that, because I think I'm summarizing kind of what Richard's talking about there with what we choose to do. Do we choose to take the shortcut, or do we choose to take Chelsea changed her mind. All right, I got that message. That's fine. Caitlin Rose, did you have your hand up a second ago? Yeah, go ahead and unmute your microphone. Tell us what you're thinking.
I was just going to add on to what Barron was saying, kind of along the same lines, was I don't, and what Jeff was saying too, but I don't think, like Jeff was saying, that God put anything evil into this world. God can't create evil. And so when people do think, I think everything is in moderation. I think we take things that God put into this world, and what creates the sin is when we overuse it. We'll use, whatever word you want to put there. But when we overuse or when we underuse the good things that God has created. So we overuse pride and that becomes a problem, or we underuse, justice, like we were just talking about, and we do things wrong to other people. Then I think that's when it becomes sin, is when we don't take what God has given us and use it in moderation. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of how I've always thought about it, because I struggle with, the problem of, why do bad things happen, like a lot of people do. And we talk about choice and we talk about free will, and we talk about how it's because of sin in the world. Well, God didn't put sin into the world. God put good things. The tree of knowledge of good and evil was not a bad thing. It was made into something different when humans messed it up. And so, I don't know, that's just something I always think about, is everything in moderation, because God created it all for good. And that's something that, I don't know. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that ties in with everything we've talked about tonight, is that we have the potential to do all of these things and make them good things. And yet when we take them and twist them or don't live up to them or something like that, then we fail, and that's where the video eventually gets up to. We fail to be fully human when we don't live up to all of that goodness that God has put into the system. Brian, you first, and then Chelsea.
Well, I was just going to say, I thought it's really interesting that Caitlin hit on this and Autumn hit on it too. What you just said about that failure to actually be human. Isn't it interesting that most of the time what we say is we fail because we're human?
Right.
We say, well, I'm only human. But the reality is God created human, and God created human as good and perfect. And when we sin, we're actually failing to live up to the humanity that God created.
Exactly. I thought to me, I don't think they did it as a big reveal at the end of the video, but the idea that Jesus comes along and is the embodiment of what a human was meant to be. to fully love God and to fully love other people. That's what it means to be human. And when we fail, when we give in to lesser urges, desires, or options, then we are not living up to being human, because God did make us good. I think that's a great point. Now, Chelsea had a hand up, and then I recommended that she mute the camera. So I'm going to let her unmute herself and share what she's got to say, and then Andy give some thought.
I was just going to say that oftentimes sin notes a lack of humility on our end. We can just look at the story of Eve. She wanted knowledge and wisdom, and she was convinced that she had to take matters into her own hands to get it. Whereas if she had just turned away from the tree and gone to God instead, that probably would have worked out a whole lot better for her and humanity. And I think sometimes, the same thing with us, we try to look for things in the world that should come from God to fulfill things in us that should come from God. But when we try to look for it elsewhere, it ends up hurting us and turning into sin or hurting other people.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's a great point, is that she was trying to obtain something that she could have gotten from God. I don't think that God was leaving her out in the cold and trying to deny her things. And most of the time in the world, we go out and we seek another option, another opportunity, and Satan's just going to sit there and he's going to wait for us to show interest in something, and he's going to be like, oh, that's something that catches their eye. Yeah. The only way that you can get that is to come over here, and fall into that. And so, while I do think that sin is a choice that we make, I think that there are forces out there working to get us to make the wrong choice that we have to be aware of. Andy, what were you going to say?
Circling back a little bit, a couple of different thoughts, but really like the idea that a few of you guys shared, that sin is not something that God created. Evil is not something that God created, but it's a failure to achieve what we're supposed to be. I mean, I think that's what, if you look at Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Kind of that and fallen short, it's almost an adverbial phrase trying to explain what sin is. Sin is falling short of the glory of God.
Right.
That's kind of what it's talking about there. And then when the video referenced, sin crouching, it automatically brought to my mind 1 Peter 5:8, that, Satan is roaming around like a roaring lion, seeking someone he may devour. In Romans chapter 7, verse 7, talking about the law, and was the law sin, the law that God gave the Israelites in the Old Testament, it says it wasn't sin, but the law was given so that sin could be shown to be utterly sinful. Basically that the law was given so that we would understand, here's the right thing to do. And when we understand the right thing to do, when we fail to do that, we are doing the wrong thing. And it says in that passage there, starting in Romans 7:7, that sin is personified. Going back again to, is sin something out there to get us? In some ways, sin is something out there to get us. It takes advantage of us, because when we learn what is right, it is really that, all the way back to the garden, it is that forbidden fruit kind of idea, that there is within mankind, for whatever reason, this desire that if something is not something we're supposed to have, it only makes us want it more. And that's what Romans 7:7 talks about. So I don't think that sin is something that God created, but I do think, as you just said, Adam, that Satan is that lion that is waiting. He's crouching. He's ready to look, and he's going to try to do everything that he can do to get us to fail. So while sin may not be in and of itself something that is after us, there are forces, like you said, that are going to use what's good, like the law, to tempt us to do bad.
Yeah, that makes things really frustrating when people can use good things to cause us to trip. Jeff, what you got? These are good thoughts. I appreciate it.
Well, first of all, I'm not insecure. Okay.
We most of us know that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, my point earlier was just how I see it. So that was
Right.
an I statement. There are forces out there, and
I was more worried you were going to beat me up.
Well, that's fair. Yeah.
yeah, well,
He's not denying
Okay.
it.
I got to consider that one. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I mean, yes, there are forces out there. The devil is the force that's out there. Okay, just like what was mentioned, a roaring lion. I mean, if you ever really analyze that whole picture there of the roaring lion, how it gets its prey, the lions circle around the herd, wait for a weak one to break its way out, and then they get between the weak one and the rest of the herd.
Right.
I mean, that's us in the church, basically. But when I look at, in James chapter 1, asking for wisdom, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, as it relates to, trials and tribulations, I can usually look back and it's not one of those things, and don't get me wrong here, and I don't want to be taken out of context here, because I don't, I'm not one of those that believes that, if you're a bad person or whatever, you're going to suffer this and that and the other thing. That's not my point at all. It's just a lot of times when, I can look back, and if there's something going on that's really uncomfortable, we'll just put it that way. A lot of times I can look back and say, hey, that is the result of a chain reaction of maybe a choice I made or a series of choices that I made.
Right.
Okay. But, again, with any trial and tribulation, there are so many different things that can happen. But with sin, for me, again, it's that looking back and saying, what choice did I make?
Right.
God has given us free will. Nobody forced me to do anything. There's forces out there that tempt me and do all of that, but it was still my choice.
Yeah, and that does fit in perfectly with what James 1 talks about. Let no one say, when we're tempted, that I've been tempted by God, for God tempts no man. And then it goes on and it describes that, process of being led away by, being enticed by our own desires. And then they lead to sin, and then sin grows up and brings death and brings those consequences. I think that's exactly what you're describing and talking about. And I think that points out another aspect of sin and a part of this failure problem that I thought was really significant in the video. A lot of times the failure is not just in a failure to act correctly. It's a failure to recognize the right thing to do. It's a failure to see past our own selfishness, our own desires, our own limitations. He talked about the word being deceived. We are deceived in this world. And I'm looking at passages in the New Testament. Andy already mentioned Romans 7, in verse 11, it says, sin seized the opportunity afforded by a commandment. It deceived me, and through that very commandment put me to death. In 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 9, don't be deceived. The sexually immoral, the idolaters, the adulterers, et cetera, these people are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. Galatians 6 and verse 7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. So all of these concepts about deception, I think that's as much a failure out there that we have to be aware of, is our own failure to even recognize sometimes. And that's why God has to come give us direction. And when we follow it, it's great and it helps us be elevated. But like at Romans 7 and what Andy pointed out, when we know the right thing specifically and we fail to do it, we put ourselves in a double bind, and it's even worse off, than we were before. Brian, what were you going to say?
I was just thinking about the way that video handled that. It talks about, it gives some examples that that illustrate, I think, how easy it is for us to deceive ourselves.
Right.
Just to convince ourselves that, this isn't really sin, or in our day and age, maybe more often that we convince ourselves that it's not that big of a deal. I have another preacher friend who likes to say that humans have an amazing capacity for self-deception. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges in trying to address sin in our own lives, because we either sweep it under the rug and pretend it's not there, or we dismiss the serious nature of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And in that one of Jesus' parables, in the Sermon on the Mount, we walk around and we're really good at spotting the specks in other people's eyes, and we're like, let me get that for you. And we're walk around with this big old log sticking out of our eye. It's kind of funny. Autumn?
Well, I was just going to say that kind of brings it full circle back to the pride issue. We don't want to admit that we've been deceived, and so we slough sin off as something else that wasn't our fault, because we can't admit that we've been deceived, that we have fallen prey to, the beast of sin, so to speak. And that goes back to that pride issue.
That's a great point. Yeah. It's after 8:00, so I want to kind of wind us down. I could keep talking about this for a long time. This has been a really good discussion. I appreciate this. Burns shares the reality that life is short, death is sure. Is the cause, and Christ is the cure.
We can't hear you.
Pretty being willing to come,
Life is short.
jump in and help us out.
Cause Christ is the cure. That's what
Oh no! Am I back? Am I back?
Yeah, Andy fixed it. Andy said it for us.
Thank you very much. I can't believe that. Of course, as soon as I try to start doing something, but what I was going to say is I'm going to let Brian have a word and Andy have a word, just to share any major ideas that they had that they didn't get a chance to get out. And then I'm going to talk about this Sunday, so don't disappear. We got some big announcement about that. But this idea that what is sin, whatever you decide about that answer to that question, remember what Romans 6 tells us, that we are slaves of sin, whether it's external, whether it's internal. That failure to be the humans that God created us to be, when we are outside of Christ, we are slaves of sin, and we're supposed to do everything we can to break free of that. Now, of course, we can't do it, but Jesus is the perfect embodiment of what we were meant to be, because he didn't give in to that. He was not a slave of sin. And I thought that was pretty powerful. And that idea, these videos, they're going to circle back around to how Jesus answers the problem of sin, of transgression, and of iniquity, which we'll look at in the next couple of weeks. And why is the gospel such good news? Well, Jesus was the perfect human. He was the fulfillment of Israel. He was the fulfillment of the law. He is the perfect embodiment of us as people, and breaks that cycle and gives us the chance to break the cycle. I'm glad y'all were here. Like I said, we got an announcement when we finish after a prayer, but Brian, what else did you have? Any other closing ideas?
Well, I usually only have about 1 or 2 good thoughts per day or two, so I'm dried up.
Well, that was you're in good company. You're in good company. Autumn, you're unmuted, so whatever you want to share with us, keep talking. That's fine. All right. That's good. Andy, what you thinking?
Just going back to the thought about the speck in the log, and I think in some ways sin's a struggle because we fail to realize who our standard is. We look at so many others and we say, well, at least I'm not as bad as so and so. The video talked about how the Old Testament word for sin can be translated missing the mark. So when we read Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, we say, well, I didn't hit the bullseye, but at least I'm on the target. Or I didn't hit the bullseye and I'm not really that close, but at least I'm closer than Brian is, or at least I'm closer than Adam is, or at least I'm closer than this person or that person. We compare ourselves to one another rather than comparing ourselves to God. And recently I ran across, and again in our study of Romans, an idea that instead of thinking about missing the mark as missing the bullseye, which is good, and that's a legitimate idea, but instead of thinking about it that way, think about it as a chasm that we have to leap across, and God's glory is on the other side. Whether whether it's 100 feet or however long it is, if I jump and leap 5 feet and then I fall down to the chasm, I'm dead. But if I leap and I jump 99 feet, 99% of the way, and I don't make it, I'm dead. So appreciating sin and what sin is, falling short of God's glory, really helps us to appreciate God's grace. And I've been really blessed by the study of Romans, just to understand just how amazing God's grace truly is, because it is that justification that only comes through Jesus' perfection that allows us to deal with our sin and not be happy with it, not sin so that grace may increase, Romans 6:1, but respond to God from a place of thanksgiving rather than from a place of let me check off these things and be self-righteous, because I'll never be self-righteous enough to be able to go to heaven.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not going to make it. And that's why sin should be so disgusting to us. If we could see that the way that God sees that, instead of making these little measurements and making these lists of here's stuff that's not that bad and here's stuff that is bad, and it's always your stuff that's really bad and my stuff that's not so big a deal, instead of seeing it, every time we give into that less than nature, we are not going to make it across. We're not going to be sufficient, and without Christ, none of us are sufficient. And that's what this good news is about. I think that's a great point. Find out what sin is in your life this week and do everything you can to run away from it, avoid it at all costs, and do the good that you have been called to do. That's exactly right. We're going to finish with a prayer, and then I'm going to tell you about Sunday. So if you've got to make got to split after this, I understand, but big things to talk about right after this. So would you bow with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we are thankful for this time that we have been able to open up your word, to see it depicted for us in ways that have been helpful to think about the big themes, the big pictures, the overall impact of the Bible and what it's trying to get across to us. Help us to follow that. Help us to live in that when we read your word and also when we live our lives. We are trying to avoid sin. Help us to do everything we can to live up to your expectations for us. Matthew 5:48 says, however we read that it does call us to be perfect as you are perfect. And we do want to do everything in our power to be found in you alone, whole and complete. And we know that it is only through that we can. But as we try to live in the footsteps of Christ, and as we try to shine help us to be the kind of people that you wanted us to be, that you created us to be that city set on a hill so that we could shine like stars in the night sky. Thank you for the forgiveness that you bring to us as we ask for it, as your grace covers us through the blood of Christ, and help us to stand and try again. And it's in his name that we offer this prayer to you tonight. And amen. All right, I've done everything I can to hold us off. But this Sunday morning at 10 a.m., we are going to have an in-person worship service here at the church building. And I wanted to let you know what we are doing to make that as safe as possible. I see that Brian and Andy are waving at each other. And they're heading out. That's what I thought. They're not going to be driving up here. So, and Andy does live in South Carolina, so it's after 9 o'clock for him. But for those of us who are local and who are interested, we are going to have an in-person worship service, but we have got to make some adjustments to that in order to not only ensure safety for everyone there, but so that we can show ourselves to be responsible citizens, so that we can show ourselves to be doing everything in our power to respect the decisions that have been made from those in positions of power, our government, our health advisors, and everything like that. So we're really excited about this. Want to encourage you to get to the church building a little bit early on Sunday morning because we are anticipating anticipating some congestion and some issues, but we're going to do the best that we can to implement some changes so that we can meet in the auditorium. And if we have to, we're going to have an overflow area set up down in the fellowship hall. Now, we're not going to open the fellowship hall just right off the bat. When we fill up the auditorium, if we need to, we'll start sending folks downstairs. We're going to kind of mark off limits most of the building so that we don't have to disinfect everything around us. We're just going to stick to the auditorium. We got bathrooms in the back foyer. If you need to use the restroom, those are going to be available at the back. And if we have to overflow downstairs into the fellowship hall, we'll do that as well. But we're going to have to sit differently. We're only going to be able to fill up every other pew. So pews are going to be marked off. Our elders on Sunday morning are going to direct you to the right seat for you to sit in so that we can fill the auditoriums. Whichever entrance you want to go into is fine. We're going to start in the middle and we're going to fill it towards the front and the back as people arrive. When you get to the building, just like you've seen the lines at Walmart, you've seen the lines at Lowe's and other businesses, the 6-foot distancing, we're going to practice that. So when you get out of your cars, and come towards the entrances, stay 6 feet behind the folks that are in front of you. We'll have the bulletin that you can pick up, and we'll also have communion available to pick up as you're entering in, and then you'll be directed to your seat. When you pick up communion, there'll be a collection tray available. If you have a contribution that you want to make, you can do that before the service or at the end. You don't have to wear a mask, but if you've got a mask, we're recommending that you bring those. We're encouraging folks to have masks. We have learned that singing, as wonderful as it is, it's a really easy way to spread this virus if anybody were to have it. So singing is going to be something we're especially concerned about. We're still going to sing. We're not going to cut that out. But if you had a mask when you were singing, it would greatly reduce the capacity for anything to be spread through the air. So we want to recommend that you be looking into ways to do that if possible. We're also reminding everybody, just because we're meeting at the building does not mean everybody has to come. If you have any symptoms, if you're not feeling well, if you have a greater risk, if you become infected, or if you work with or live with people who are at greater risk, we want you to stay home. We don't want anybody to feel obligated to come out if it's going to cause a greater risk to anyone around them or to themselves. We're still going to stream the service. It's still going to be available online. We're going to make all of those things still available. But we are going to try to meet in person for those that are able to do it. Now, we're still not meeting on Sunday nights or Wednesday nights. Those are still online only, but we are still planning to offer an online option, a devotional, a thought, a class like what we're doing now. We'll have more updates and details about that once we figure out how well our Sunday morning things are going. It's really